I could start off with some of the questions. It's nice to be here with you, Ambassador Koenig. And let's see, I guess I'll start off with question A, just keep it simple.
Mhm.
So the first question that we have for you is, how has the role of U.S. diplomacy evolved over your years at the State Department? If you just want to elaborate, you don't have to stick too much to the questions, they're just a general guide too. But what do you think?
Well, thanks a lot, and thanks, Blake, for being here, and also thank you, Vishwa. Um, well, I thought about this since you suggested that this might be a topic, and I would say that it would be perhaps better to use the word devolved rather than evolved, even though that sounds highly critical. But I'm afraid we should have a critical perspective on the way that U.S. Foreign policy and engagement in international relations has evolved over the time that I was in the Foreign Service, those 30 years. Um, it's not just that our execution of international relations and diplomacy as part of that has devolved. I think the concept of diplomacy, the genuine concept of diplomacy, of engagement, of compromise, of negotiation, of trying to reach mutually acceptable outcomes, has lost support in the American political and foreign affairs debate. Why is this? I ask myself that all the time. One factor that is often cited and I think is highly relevant is the increasingly dominant role that the military plays in the execution of US foreign policy. That has rendered diplomacy less central to our efforts in international relations. There were two, I think, major steps in this evolution. One that is sometimes cited and is sort of institutional in its nature is the Goldwater-Nichols Act of 1986, which reorganized the defense establishment in very many ways. But one of the most important for my work was the creation of the so-called regional combatant commanders, the COCOMs, things like UCOM or CENTCOM or PACOM. That really strengthened the role of the US military command structure and opened a door to them to engage a lot more in things that were traditionally reserved more for diplomacy and for civilians. The military assistance programs and engagement programs that were run by these combatant commands were often very significant and sometimes even overshadowed the work of civilian agencies. The other big event, not surprisingly, was the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001, which sort of knocked us, I think, a little bit off of center and launched us on a course of policy development and action that was, in the end, I think, not very well conceived. Other things also lessened the role of diplomacy. One of the most important was probably the breakdown of the bipartisan consensus. The Iraq invasion, of course, had a big role in that. But I think Iran policy has been much more contentious for a much longer time, and it has been more susceptible, I would say, to external interference to exploit partisan divides in the United States and kind of reduce the space for a rational discussion of Iran policy. And finally, I think our own sort of drive to become more unilateral in our behavior internationally has reduced the role of diplomacy and diplomats. We have often been the worst breakers of the rules that we ourselves wrote for international affairs. There are sad cases like the International Criminal Court, where we participated in negotiating sort of in order to protect our interests on the Rome Statute, and then refused to even attempt to ratify it. And in the end, under the Trump administration, went so far as to threaten to arrest the head of the International Criminal Court for having endorsed an inquiry into human rights violations by Israel and Palestinian organizations and war crimes in that region. We have our drone program of targeted killings, which is intensely unilateral and hasn't received enough scrutiny over the last, let's say, 7 or 8 years. We have the real abuse of our sanctions regime. Sometimes I can't really overstate how much time and energy we devote to sanctions. I spent a lot of my time as a senior US diplomat in Europe talking about sanctions, probably surprisingly large amount of that time. And we have tended to move from fairly narrow focused sanctions on kinds of behavior that are clearly illegitimate in international relations, like terrorist finance and proliferation of WMD and precursors and those kinds of things, to apply sanctions much more broadly as a policy instrument in what we sometimes describe as, I guess, muscular diplomacy, but is more correctly described, I think, as coercive diplomacy. So, you know, sadly, overall, I would say we have become wedded to this notion of American leadership and American exceptionalism, and even more broadly stated, an American purpose, at the same time as our place in the world has diminished and our willingness to engage in diplomacy has also fallen off. By the way, I'd like to just add at the very end of this that I think this is a good reason for young people to go into the Foreign Service. It doesn't sound like a real sales pitch, does it? But we need more young people to come into the Foreign Service with their perspectives on things, their understanding of how to move issues forward, their drive to bring their priorities to the State Department and the US government and the execution of foreign policy. You know, the service is no longer quite as male, pale, and Yale as it used to be, but it could still use a lot of change in every dimension of diversity, including diversity of ideas. So I hope that a lot of people at Yale and other places will be thinking about careers in the State Department and the Foreign Service.
So I would like to ask a quick follow-up question, if you don't mind, on what you were just talking about. And I know that the answer that you gave addresses U.S. Let's say transgressions over a longer time frame than the last month or two. But as our audience might know, and as we know right now, Biden just participated in the G7 here in, well, sorry, I'm in London right now, but he participated in the G7 in Cornwall, so here, not necessarily in the United States, but in the UK, as well as attended a meeting in Brussels for NATO, and is going to meet with von der Leyen and other EU top officials to discuss EU-US relations. So in terms of a change in the presidency, a recent change in the presidency, how do you see US foreign policy adapting? Do you see that as a good change heralded by the Biden presidency, one that's moving in the right direction, or, you know, something that is maybe a false sign?
I wouldn't call it a false sign. I actually think I'm quite positive about the changes that have been made by the Biden administration. So I don't mean I'm critical. I'm further. I'm in a little bit of a different position with regard to a lot of these issues than the Biden administration is. But in many ways, they have corrected mistakes that were made by the Trump administration. And in some ways, a few ways, I think they've begun to signal that they are going to take foreign policy and American international engagement in a new direction, which would be a positive thing. I particularly think that the role of Joe Biden personally and his national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, that role is critical. These two individuals, I think, are more open-minded and perhaps a little bit more reflective about traditional American foreign policy goals than a lot of other people in this administration, many of whom I know. So what do I think about these latest developments? Well, I mean, kind of on the one hand, on the other hand, about the Biden administration, it's also the way I feel about the results of this trip. The G7 communique, I think, set out as its top issues the ones that belong there. So that would be, of course, in light of the COVID pandemic, pandemic disease, climate change and how to address it globally, the issue of international inequality, disparities, all these things, which is related to new schemes for international development. These were sort of the top line issues in the communique, which is the demonstration of agreement. That's where you show where you actually have arrived at agreement in the G7. And those were all good topics to lead with. But unfortunately, the level of ambition is rather low. There's a lot of lofty talk, but as many people have pointed out, the undertaking with regard to vaccinations for the COVID pandemic is really rather modest, certainly not adequate when you consider the potential costs of the future evolution of the disease. And I would say the same is true, as some others have pointed out, for environmental issues and global warming. It's a very modest set of objectives that they set out. They clothe it all in extremely ambitious sort of verbiage, but in fact, the real commitments are very, very modest relative to the threat. And this is, I think, one of the tragedies of international relations and American foreign policy over the course of my lifetime. We tend to sort of run to where the drama is. We love the sort of confrontational element of foreign policy, but the cooperative element of foreign policy and the real challenge, the sort of existential challenge of some of these things, new technologies that are highly disruptive, global climate change, pandemic disease, we don't get very excited about them. And the constituency for major investments in these kinds of challenges is low, is small in the United States. So, you know, I don't feel good about this. I think that unfortunately, if you were to follow the coverage of the G7 and also the NATO summit, and to a degree even the US-EU summit, in the American media, you would think that it was all about China and whether or not Joe Biden can persuade everyone to get on the bandwagon for a more confrontational policy with China. I think that was the message that the US government wanted to send. They used every outlet they could to push forward that version of these meetings. And therefore the coverage, even though I feel it's far too over dramatized and so forth, you know, I don't really care whether Joe Biden and Vladimir Putin get on. The coverage is pushed in that direction. It's made into infotainment. And that's partly the responsibility of our own officials. They highlight these things. So I think that's really regrettable. But we're working, I think, in a very difficult public environment in the United States, which has been molded by years of rather misguided, I think, I don't know if it's education, but certainly public discourse. One thing that really struck me recently, and this is a completely different story, when the intelligence community report on the UFO sightings by American military personnel came out, you know, you would think that people, if they thought there was substantial evidence that there were really extraterrestrials visiting the world in these kind of technologically super powered vehicles, that we would think, wow, this is like a really existential, I mean, this is about human existence. This is about our place in the universe. This is somehow deeper than the way it was treated as a national security threat. Like, this is, I mean, we have a kind of Independence Day movie style approach to these things, which is just ludicrous. We need to be a little more reflective, a little more connected to the things that we really care about, and a little bit less wedded to the drama of confrontation.
Great. So I think we got a good survey of your current foreign policy perspectives. I know that we've previously engaged in this discussion of kind of branding yourself in foreign policy, and that kind of debate between realism and progressivism and constructivism and how they all interact. And you've previously described yourself as a Jeffersonian realist. Could you explain to our audience what that means and how you would kind of advise young people like me to arrive at a certain school of thought, and what that really does for you in terms of your career?
Sure. You know, I didn't call myself so much a Jeffersonian realist. I did, however, convey to you that a colleague of mine at the University of Washington had described my views after another forum as being those of a Jeffersonian realist. And I'm afraid I would not run away from the term, but I think I am essentially a neo-realist. And I find that I agree with many perspectives that are shared by writers who I think embrace the neo-realist school and really span the ideological spectrum in the United States, because realism and neo-realism are less driven by the goals of foreign policy than about the practice of foreign policy. In my view, the two schools that kind of informed my work, if you want to cite them, would be realism and liberalism. One stressing international institutions and norms, and the other being one that stresses sort of the mechanics of foreign policy and the definition of national interest and the role of states in an anarchic international environment. Those, I think, to the extent that I thought about these schools while I was working as a diplomat, were the ones that informed my work. And I remain, I think, fairly wedded to them to the degree that they are tools of analysis. As far as the schools of sort of more academic analysis, I was a practitioner, but academic analysis, I see a lot of value in constructivism. It's very close to what I studied when I was an undergraduate and even as a graduate student. I was an anthropology major and I studied cultural anthropology, and a lot of these things about epistemology and all these kinds of concepts that play such a role in constructivism are shared with anthropology and several other of the social sciences, but especially anthropology. I just don't find it very useful as a tool for policy development. It reveals a lot about the conduct of international affairs and foreign policy, but it doesn't lead to very clear prescriptions for what to do. And when you're a practitioner, after all, you go in and you do things every day rather than just think about them. So it's really a challenge, I think, for this school to formulate thoughts that are relevant to the policy process. I got a question one time not long ago. Somebody asked me, you have your kind of tendentious views about things here and there in the Middle East. What do you think of Edward Said's perspective? And it's like, I like it, but it doesn't make any difference. It's really, really difficult to translate some of these more purely academic analytical schemes into policy. I would hope that they could get more into policy by being embraced by people who are involved in policy. That would help. I think the bigger problem, though, is not so much these schools, which don't factor very largely in our work from day to day, but this notion of Wilsonianism and its hold on, I think, the American foreign policy establishment. There is a strong drive to make the world safe for democracy in the foreign policy establishment. The Germans call it, just sort of dismissively and somewhat weirdly, Aktionismus, a desire to always act. And I'm afraid this is a major problem with American foreign engagement. We sort of have the position, act first and think later, because we are so obsessed with the notion that by controlling a situation, by sort of getting on top of it, we will somehow be able to manage it to the benefit, not just of ourselves, let's say, but to others and to the so-called rules-based order of international affairs. I think this is a big mistake. And it derives from a vast overestimate of the place of the United States in the world and our ability to influence the course of events, and also our stake in these events that happen in different parts of the world. We seem to think that everything has a bearing on the well-being of Americans. We need to get much closer to national interest, and that's another reason why I really like realism or neo-realism. I think clearly these different groups, progressives, liberals, constructivists perhaps, Wilsonians, isolationists, they will have a very different perspective on what the national interest is. But we really need to discuss it a little bit. We don't even talk about it. We are willing to take anybody's assertion that something is a national interest as an imperative in many cases to intercede. And I find this frustrating. Recently, the outbreak of violence between Palestinians and Israel was a great example of this. Martin Indyk, a very well-known and I think very respected and credible observer and participant in policymaking with regard to the Middle East, said this kind of very frequent thing, you can turn your back on the Middle East, but the Middle East won't turn your back on you. Well, okay. In what way was this violence somehow directed against the United States or a challenge against the United States? Clearly, it was disruptive to regional peace. I mean, and it maybe required some response, but it was not about America. And the notion that everything that goes wrong in the world somehow is about the United States and therefore requires an American response with so-called American leadership under the indispensable nation brand that Madeleine Albright gave us is nonsense. And we need to stop doing it. We're not being a constructive member of the international community. We are ignoring the real challenges that face mankind, and we are obsessing over day-to-day sort of confrontation of sort of events and players in the international system whom we regard as non-constructive or disruptive.
And how would you say that this kind of definition of national interest that you're suggesting may interact with something like, let's say, the responsibility to protect in the case of a violent eruption or potential genocide? As we've kind of seen, the United States was heavily criticized for failing to intervene in Rwanda during the Rwandan genocide. So how would you propose kind of reconciling the both in a good sphere?
I think they can be reconciled. I first of all believe to a considerable degree, not as a imperative, but as a concept in the responsibility to protect. And I was very much involved in the Libya operation because I worked directly for the commander as his political advisor in the NATO command structure. So that was undertaken initially with the notion in mind of something like the responsibility to protect because of the threat that Gaddafi posed to the people in Benghazi and eastern Libya at that point during the Arab Spring. I think it can be resolved by this apparent contradiction can be resolved through multilateral engagement and a greater willingness to enter into international agreements, including binding international agreements, which the United States has tended to eschew now for more than 20 years. There will always be this kind of après-vous Gaston problem in international engagement or interventions where nobody really wants to seize the nettle and go in and take the risk of involvement in the hard part of intervention and stabilization and reconstruction. And we should be extremely judicious in what our role is. We should not always want to lead. And in fact, in Libya, we did not lead, but we provided the critical sort of enablers for that operation to take place. I think that is the appropriate role unless there's a much stronger impact on American vital national interest than just the general concern, which is a valid one, about the responsibility to protect. But the US also hasn't really endorsed the responsibility to protect. In fact, when I was a diplomat, we would fight against the responsibility to protect as a principle in international relations when Canada and Sweden and others were putting it forward, because we thought that it would sort of require us to take action in some cases where we might not want to. So this tendency to try to evade commitments that are broad-based and international and maybe even global is a major flaw in our policy. I think we need to commit much more closely and strongly to multilateral engagement, realizing that it entails compromise and the acceptance that the views of others will influence the outcome in ways that sometimes we might find to be deleterious. We tend to walk away far too soon and throw up our hands and act unilaterally.
Excellent. And it's very interesting to hear about your experiences as part of the NATO command. And also we have another question that sort of relates to that topic, but in a different region. Instead of Libya, we wanted to ask about Afghanistan. So using your experiences as a deputy permanent resident or representative to the US mission at NATO, how did you interact with the United States' contentious involvement in Afghanistan / the Middle East as a region, and what were your key recommendations?
Well, it was a little complicated. First of all, I was against the Iraq invasion from the beginning, and that happened, that agreement happened just as I was going to NATO as the deputy chief of mission, deputy perm rep. And just before I arrived, it caused great discord in NATO. So I'm going to treat, I think, the Iraq invasion and our Middle East engagement somewhat separately from Afghanistan. So I worked a lot on, while at NATO headquarters, on things that derived from our decision to invade Iraq with a coalition of supporting countries. some of those things were intended to mend fences between the US and our allies who were opposed, most notably France and Germany, to our invasion. Some of them were intended to somehow supplement or supplement our efforts or ameliorate the damage that caused by our efforts in the region. So NATO was not directly involved in operations in Iraq, any combat operations during my time, and really never during the history of the Iraq engagement of the United States and the coalition. I helped to create the NATO training mission in Iraq, which was just a supplementary effort, but it could enlist allies in a broader sense, and also obtained the endorsement of Paris and Berlin, which was important to us and important to Paris and Berlin. They didn't want this rift to persist in the NATO alliance. Another thing I worked on there was outreach to the Middle East, the creation of more formal group outreach by NATO to the countries of the Gulf Cooperation Council, the so-called Istanbul Cooperation Initiative. I came up with the name because every other name that we suggested was so contentious. I worked a lot with the Italian mission, which had strong views about this and how it related to the NATO's Mediterranean dialogue, which is very important to Italy, quite naturally. But I also worked a great deal and learned a great deal from the Deputy Secretary General of NATO, an Italian, Alessandro Minuto Rizzo, a friend of mine. I stay in touch with him quite a bit still. He taught me a lot about how to sort of set realistic goals, be persistent, listen a lot. And that's how we managed to create what we managed to create. It wasn't a grand initiative, but it helped to sort of fill in the gap in the Middle East so that NATO could have a dialogue with countries which shared some of its security concerns and interests. Afghanistan was a little bit different. First of all, there was really broad consensus about the NATO operation, or the American invasion of Afghanistan, and the NATO operation that moved in behind the United States and the coalition. And there were a few doubts, I would say, at the time that I was there, that this was a mission that had to be conducted. Completely different from Iraq. And I was very much involved in the effort to, first of all, transfer ISAF, which was a UN-mandated training and a stabilization mission, to NATO. It was a handoff by the Canadians to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in Kabul, and then to enlarge ISAF all the way around Afghanistan, or to sort of create a mechanism for other countries to take on a lot more of the security burden at the kind of lower end. So not so much combat and counterterrorism, but the lower end security burden in Afghanistan. And that succeeded. But already, I will say, in 2005, while I was still at NATO, the signs of failure were strong. I should have said more, I think. We had quite a few sort of emperor has no clothes briefings in the North Atlantic Council and other settings in Brussels by commanders and other experts, people involved in things like the training of Afghan security forces, or the counter-narcotics efforts of various parties, the United States coalition and NATO. It was really already pretty evident that we were not going to succeed in this sort of more ambitious mission of transforming Afghanistan and creating a sort of stable long-term situation in Afghanistan. And that's a place where I'm very encouraged by the evolution of Joe Biden's thought. He was a person who fairly early on took a stand for a narrower focus for the mission. In the Obama administration, he famously argued against the surge, which brought forces above 100,000 in Afghanistan. And he then now has agreed that the US has to end this mission because simply we are there without a mission. We're there without clear mission objectives. We are simply a placeholder, sort of one of many participants in a security environment which is not evolving in a way that is positive or has much bearing, to be honest, on American national interest.
So you previously served as the political advisor to the NATO Joint Forces Command in Naples, Italy. So my question is, what were your main priorities in this role, and how did you come about the process of defining them? Like, which principles did those priorities evolve from?
Yeah. It was a great job, I will just say at the beginning. It was something very different from anything I had done before in the Foreign Service. And I actually had to kind of leave the Foreign Service in order to take the job. I later came back in. We had two major areas of activity in that headquarters. One was overseeing the sort of small, relatively small NATO operations in the former Yugoslavia. KFOR was by far the largest at that stage, and managing those operations as well as our engagement with a large number of countries, including the countries most interested in these operations, like Serbia and Bosnia and Montenegro. That was one part of the job. And that engagement role was broader as well. So we talked a lot to a large number of countries, Israel, Turkey, everybody. The other part was the role that I had in participating in oversight of the Libya bombing campaign. I won't really get into the Libya bombing campaign more unless you want, but it was a tragic example of mission creep and irresponsible behavior by the United States and the international community, as recognized by President Obama himself. But how did I define what I wanted to do? I wanted to work on the things that were most important. So I was sitting in a military headquarters at the operational level, overseeing sort of the actual mission commands out in the field. And I wanted to work on the things that were most important. And this is a bit unusual for a political advisor. Typically, they are not exactly shunted aside, but they're sort of channeled into basically supplementary or complementary work that has a lot more to do with just diplomatic engagement by the headquarters. But that wasn't what I wanted to do. I was a little more ambitious. So I wanted to influence military planning, which is really what it's all about. So I just set about doing two things. One was to become a trusted advisor of my three successive American four-star admiral commanders, and I did. I spent more time with them probably than almost anybody else in the headquarters, except perhaps their deputies. And I was even made at one stage the operational director in a joint headquarters, so operations director. So I was in the position of a major general in the U.S. Army, which I probably wasn't qualified to do, but I really tried to bring myself close to the work of the headquarters at its most essential. And I also had a great staff composed of NATO national officers. Most of them were majors, lieutenant colonels, and colonels. And they did a lot of analysis, and my direction to them, and they did a fantastic job, was to influence defense planning, to influence the operational planning in the headquarters by engaging very actively with the relevant parts of the headquarters itself and with the headquarters of the various operations down in the field, KFOR or the Bosnia operation, et cetera. And they did that very well. So I was very, very happy with the outcome of all this. I think we managed to bring both my perspective plus the perspective of my team to bear on what was the core work of the headquarters, rather than just sort of be a engagements secretary for the commander.
Yes, and so this question is kind of near and dear to my heart. I'm very interested in studying European foreign affairs later after college and maybe in my career. Sorry, let me find the question here. Sorry. So you've been stationed in many European countries during your time in the U.S. Foreign Service, and I sort of have a set of three sub-questions and one major question, so feel free to address whatever part, and if you need to be reminded, I will say them again. But I was curious about your opinions about the role of the EU in guiding economic and security policy for the majority of European states right now. And specifically, topics that would be interesting to touch upon are the idea or the place of the United States' security umbrella in Europe. So NATO generally standing in for the security of many European states, especially against Russia. And then sub question also is, and this is more of a yes or no opinion question, but do you believe that Monet's vision for federal Europe is still possible? Or if that's the direction of the EU at all? And then lastly, tie that in a little bit with the role of Germany within the EU and US-German relations, along with US-EU and German-EU relations.
Well, those are great questions. And, you know, as a person who spent the last 20 years of his career, my career, living in the EU and working a lot with the EU and also with NATO and with European national governments, I'm a great believer in these institutions. And I think that Americans need to try much harder to understand how they work and what they seek to do. Let's start with the big sort of meta question for the United States, which always comes up. What about the American security umbrella, which is provided via NATO? There was a very, very interesting article by Stephen Wertheim, I think is how I pronounce it. Wertheim, I can't help it. It's a major department store in Germany. Wertheim today in the New York Times about whether or not progressives in particular, and I'm a progressive in American political terms, whether progressives and liberals should support NATO. I have been a devoted fan of NATO for many years, and I certainly left the Foreign Service in 2015 thinking that I would never deviate from that point of view. I used to give talks about the need for a new Cold War against Russia, for example, which I wouldn't give anymore. I think we need to think about this a lot. What are we doing with the American security umbrella? What is the impact of it? We know that it has created a stable situation, and we ought not to discount that. It is quite important that we sustain stable conditions on this in this area, which is so vitally important to the world economy and American sort of interests more broadly on the globe, and our greatest partner in advancing an agenda of human rights and democratic principles, which means a lot to Americans and should, I think. So we want stability to persist in Europe, and NATO is the mechanism by which we deliver that. But what are we doing by continuing to provide the security umbrella? I think we may be creating a kind of situation where Europe doesn't get serious about defense. There's no question, and this is a point that Wertheim makes, there's no question that Europe has the capacity to undertake its own defense. It is vastly wealthier than Russia, for example, collectively. And in fact, individual European Union member states have much larger GDPs than Russia, most notably France and Germany. So why are we undertaking such a high element of the defense burden for these countries when they are able to cover their needs themselves? I think we need to constantly ask that question. It's not really so much a matter of whether countries are spending the NATO benchmark of 2% of their GDP on national defense. That's perhaps illustrative, but the problem is that they're not serious about defense. And the European Union does not have a very strong pillar regarding territorial defense. It came in the middle of the last decade, but it's never really been acted upon in any significant way. And I'm afraid we, by continuing to uphold the Article 5 guarantee in NATO and by doing other things, including leading in many cases the planning and conceptualization of NATO's engagement on the eastern edge of the alliance, we are in some ways fostering a situation where many NATO allies can shirk their national defense responsibilities. Now, what does this mean? It simply means that they're not actually undertaking one of the most basic requirements of states. And, you know, self-defense kind of comes pretty near the top of any list of what are the elements of a state. And these countries have over the years kind of rented out their self-defense requirements to the United States through this guarantee. We ought to always have it under review. And I think that if we were to back away carefully, not in the kind of haphazard and almost grotesque fashion of Donald Trump, we might actually have some positive outcomes. I've been talking and teaching about this for a long time, but I do worry that nothing is moving in the right direction. Regrettably, despite some innovations in the defense and security realm, Europe has not really bitten the bullet. They are not very serious about national defense. But I would say we should encourage them to do the unthinkable, for example, to develop a Europe-wide nuclear deterrent. It's a cheap investment in territorial defense. It is the essence of the United States Article 5 guarantee and has been for like 60 years. So we ought not to be so afraid of why or the possible proliferation effects or possible security dilemma effects that would arise from having Europe somehow manage to arrange a autonomous nuclear deterrent capability. So is it still possible to achieve the vision of a federal Europe, Jean Monnet's vision? I don't know if it's possible. I think it's worth trying. I think this intermediate stage of European integration, this creation of a sort of sui generis, unique, supranational arrangement is not very stable. And I mean, Brexit was the clearest indication of that, but the difficulties of dealing with the Hungarian government and to a degree Poland are equally indicative of a problem with sustaining an adequate level of sort of adherence to norms. And then there were pretty shocking failures of solidarity, both in the economic crisis and in the response to the COVID pandemic. So I think the bicycle will fall over eventually if it doesn't keep moving forward. And it's not moving forward. It hasn't moved forward for a long time. The one exception to that is, of course, the agreement finally by Germany to support a mechanism for shared sort of debt instruments in the context of the pandemic. And if that can be continued and you then get to another incentive to sort of harmonize more fully fiscal policy and maybe to undertake more federalization of security, that would be a good thing, I believe. I think that this confrontation between nationalist sort of sentiment and the drive toward closer integration in the European Union ought, for our interest, for the American interest, to be resolved in favor of integration and federalism. You know, the US has not always played a very constructive role in this. I'm just going to add that at the end, particularly in our approach to the Iraq invasion, but also now in the way that we're dealing with things like Nord Stream 2 and even China. We have a hard time resisting launching or sort of lobbing divisive sort of grenades into the European Union when we think it serves our interest. But I think that's to mistake our strategic interest with our sort of short-term tactical interest. I think we need to stop doing this. We have relied traditionally overmuch on a small state strategy when we're not happy with what we hear from Berlin and Paris mainly. And it used to be London, but London was almost always on our side. And now, of course, they've chosen to duck out. We need to have a higher regard for the institutional integrity of the European Union and not be so tempted to undermine it whenever we think that there's some short-term policy advantage in our own scheme of strategic objectives, such as confrontation with Russia or confrontation with China. Your microphone's not on.
I am muted. I think it's fixed now. But so you've interacted with a lot of multilateral organizations, the EU, NATO, just to name a few. I'm wondering how your kind of interactions with those organizations then shaped your time and role as a U.S. ambassador to Cyprus. And can you maybe elaborate on some of your priorities and principles in that role specifically?
Sure. Well, what I tried to do, I think, throughout my career, I came into the Foreign Service with a somewhat unusual background. I went to Johns Hopkins SAIS for my master's degree, which was not unusual. But before that, I studied anthropology, and I was rather different in terms of socioeconomic background than the majority of my colleagues. So I've been more of a sponge, I would say. I like to listen more. I talk a lot, as you have noticed, but I also try hard to listen. And I think I came into the Foreign Service, and I came into every one of my jobs in the Foreign Service with more of an open mind than a lot of my colleagues. I'm not ideological. In fact, I just can't stand ideology. I find it terribly disruptive of sort of sensible statecraft. And I'm afraid the United States has a serious sort of penchant for ideologizing everything. So I came in and I really enjoyed the jobs where I listened a lot. I mean, just to give one example that's kind of odd. I was assigned to East Berlin in the late 1980s. And one of the things that I did, because my German was very good, I wasn't a spy, but I was just a listener. I would go out with a colleague, a guy named Matthias Mantz, and we would just go to places and hang out and talk to East Germans. And these perspectives really informed my view, which tended to be accommodating. I think that people, I'm not saying that I loved the SAD and that I thought Erich Honecker was a hero. I'm saying you have to see that there is no black and white, and that basically, you're generally talking about almost incremental efforts to move major issues in the direction that you think serves American interests, and in some cases that was of the global community. So, and that has happened again in Indonesia when I was there, where I was basically full-time, not entirely, but let's say 80 to 90% spent covering Islamic political movements. I just sort of sat on the floor or in chairs and talked to people many hours a day and just absorbed what they said and interpreted it and tried to understand for the US government what Indonesian Islamic political thinkers and activists thought about issues that were important to us. So that was my background, and it continued on in international organizations. I valued the perspectives of other people. We often treated others, and this is a liability for the United States, we treat people who stand in our way, as we would put it, as obstacles to better policy, when in fact sometimes their ideas are better than ours. When you walk into a room in NATO in particular, but this is generally true even in something like the G7, where, which kind of happens in the shadows, there's no question that the American representative represents the biggest country, but there is a question whether the American representative represents the country with the best ideas or the best understanding of the problem at hand. And we tend to Bigfoot people because we are big. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we always get the best outcome. So that's one reason why I thought it was so useful to point out my relationship with Alessandro Minuto Rizzo. Italy punches under its weight. Italy has more good ideas than we're often prepared to recognize, but they often are different from American approaches. How did I use this when I became ambassador in Cyprus? Well, I knew the Cyprus problem pretty well. I had spent more time on it probably than virtually any other American diplomat, certainly any other senior American diplomat. So I kind of knew what I wanted to achieve. I had a lot of contacts on the island. I understood, I thought, how it fit into American national interest. And I had a great team in the embassy to work with, and a great team back at home in Washington to support me. And we were ambitious at the time in trying to address a possible solution to the Cyprus problem. So I had a lot of interesting work to do. But one thing I would say that I learned there is how easy it is to forget to listen to people when you are pretty well in command of the facts of the situation. You're pretty sure you know what you want to do, and you have the authority to push your ideas through without having to rely on the sort of consent or support of others. That's a real risk. That's the classic American dilemma. I think that we stop listening because we're too, we have, I think, often misguided convictions, which we hold very close to our hearts. So when I criticize some of my colleagues, former colleagues or others for advocating high risk sort of principled stands in places like Ukraine or Taiwan, it's not because I don't believe they're entirely sincere in advocating these approaches. I just don't see the connection to American interest, the balanced connection to American interest. The risk in this quixotic sort of stand is higher than the possible gain to the United States. And that's something that I think is easy to learn when you're dealing with a Cyprus problem. It's a modest advantage, modest disadvantage situation that you don't want to disrupt it so much that it becomes more dangerous for the United States at higher risk. So you have to operate in a fairly narrow band.
Awesome. And then we have one closing question here, well, technically two, but one official closing question. And that is, which you have touched upon a little bit throughout this interview, but do you have any advice for students planning on pursuing a career in diplomacy or with the State Department, especially college students?
Well, yes, please join the Foreign Service. I will just put that out there right now. It's a good time to be interested in the Foreign Service. The Foreign Service is going to be growing over the next several years. I think the Biden administration would be a really interesting one to work in. And as I said, I think some of the things that it is doing and some of the ideas that it has are very, very creative and helpful. And when I look at things that were written by Jake Sullivan, not so much since he came to office as the NSA, but in the year or two before he assumed that position, I think there are ideas lurking in the White House and in the State Department, which would be really enjoyable and important to work on. What should you do? I think looking through your journal, I saw a lot of signs that people are doing the right thing. I think studying individual cases closely and thinking about them sufficiently to write about them is a very, very useful thing to do. Because grand strategy, sort of operating at an abstract level, I think is very, very prone to idealization. So you begin to see things in black and white. But when you delve more deeply into any situation, even if you still retain a clear perspective and maybe a moral perspective on what's going on there, you see the complexities of interpersonal and interinstitutional behavior. Nothing is as clear-cut as it is portrayed, generally speaking, more superficially in the media. So I think studying these cases and putting yourself in the position to the extent that you can of the individual participants is incredibly useful. This is done all the time with the Cuban Missile Crisis. I think you've probably done it yourselves, maybe with the Cuban Missile Crisis as the case study. And I would just say that despite the common wisdom that John F. Kennedy was a hero in the Cuban Missile Crisis, and that his brilliant management of the ex-con delivered the world from nuclear holocaust, if you study it more deeply, you know that's not true. And you also know that Nikita Khrushchev was not a villain, really. He was also he was sort of co-hero, if you want to say, if you have to heroize and lionize everyone. And even Fidel Castro is understandable. So I think, international relations, to be effective, is built on understanding not so much of just the issues, but of your partners or adversaries, if they're adversaries. I think we tend to use that label too often, but the others who are engaged on the same issues with you. And this may be an anthropologist or a frustrated anthropologist talking here, but understanding the perspective of others is really the most important thing you can do in international relations. It is the essence of diplomacy. It's the only way you can achieve anything through diplomatic engagement, which, after all, is just the way to resolve differences short of the use of force. So we really, I think, I would hope that everybody would study these cases, you would get good grades, pass the test, go into the Foreign Service, and help us get better outcomes after a sort of dreary couple of decades in the international environment.
Yeah, so thank you for your insights. And before we have an official outro from Vishwa, I want to ask one quick question. So I heard that you were a Seahawks fan, and I'm also a big fan of the NFL. I'm from Tampa, Florida, so I'm a big Buccaneers fan, and it's been a great year, great past year. I'm curious what your prediction is of the Seahawks for this next season. Do you think they're going to go to the playoffs, Super Bowl? What are you feeling?
Well, Super Bowl would be a little bit of a long shot, although I never lose hope, you know. Not even when they didn't give the ball to Marshawn Lynch on the Patriots 2-yard line in Super Bowl 49. That was the closest I came, by the way, to having a physical fight with anyone since I think I was in like elementary school. I was watching the game with a bunch of people in Rome and some friends, and most of the people there were Patriots fans. And I guess I got in somebody's face. I don't know. Anyway, I backed off. He was much younger than me. Probably would have really done some damage. So what do I think? I think the Seahawks will go to the playoffs almost for sure. I know that most analysts have said that they might be the third strongest team in the Western Division. I don't buy it. I just, you know, I think that they're going to come in first or second. And I think the real contender is the Rams. I just don't have any faith in the 49ers. I'm sorry, I've watched them for a long time. If you're a Seahawks fan, you've watched the 49ers almost as closely as the Seahawks for the last few decades. I'm very committed to all of this. You know, if I did a couple of things that I'll just mention to show that I'm a real fan. I'm not a very analytical fan. My son is very much into sports statistics and was the sports editor of the Harvard Crimson and all sorts of other things. I'm just a fan. I'm just a crazy in the head fan. So when I was at the embassy in Nicosia during the playoffs in 2014 and 2015, we flew the 12th man flag under the American flag on our flagpole. I don't think that was authorized. I didn't ask for permission. It made me feel good. I think it made some people in the embassy feel bad, but hey, you know, some things are worth it. And then when I was sort of at my low point, I had a contentious relationship with the president of Cyprus toward the end of my tenure as ambassador there. My staff arranged for me to have a Zoom conversation with Marshawn Lynch, and that lifted my spirits more than anything else possible, really. So he was at that time, he had just been denied the game ball, basically, in the Super Bowl against the Patriots by Pete Carroll for a reason I will never understand. And he was holding out briefly before he re-signed with the Seahawks for the last year that he played. And I begged him to re-sign, and he gave a very Marshawn answer, something like, "Hear you, man, haven't made up my mind, thanks." Something like that. It was a very brief conversation. Really was not easy to get him to talk a whole lot more than he does normally. But I'm a big fan. I'm hopeful for the current season. I think it's the most exciting team in the NFL, year in and year out, basically. And I will add at the end that I had hoped that Tom Brady's career would finally be crushed when he went to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, but clearly I was wrong.
I mean, some things don't change, and I'm not complaining as a Tampa Bay fan, but I love the football analysis and the connections to international relations too. Vishwa, would you like to do the outro, I guess?
Yeah, sure. I mean, but before that, my family is actually a 49ers fan, so as a clan. So thank you for humbling us, Ambassador Koenig. That was great. But thank you so much for your time. We have a lot of staff writers at the Yale Review of International Studies and under our parent organization, Yale International Relations Association. And just in general, in and across Yale, we have a lot of individuals who want to go into the Foreign Service and to contribute in the right way. And your insights as a career diplomat, of course, are so incredibly helpful. So thank you so much for spending your afternoon with us. And thank you, Blake.
It was my pleasure. And thanks for arranging this across 3 widely dispersed time zones. I really appreciate the opportunity. Thanks.